Welcome to Sleepless American, the only Native American sleep channel on YouTube. Before we dive into this insane story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it over there? I love seeing how far this madness reaches. And hey, if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, drop a comment saying you'd like to see a visual version of it, with characters, scenes, and the drama playing out in front of you. Your feedback decides what comes next. Tonight's story is unlike anything you've heard before. Beneath the glitz and gold of red carpet fame lies a secret older than Hollywood itself. If you're over 45, this one hits deep. Don't just watch, witness. And if this story grips you like it gripped us, hit that like button, comment "I saw the shadow," and share this with someone who thinks they know what's real. Now let's begin. Act 1, The Mirror Room. The invitation arrived without a stamp, without an envelope, nestled between a final notice for her gas bill and a catalog for orthopedic shoes. It was a postcard, flimsy and yellowed at the edges, depicting the Golden Gate Bridge shrouded in an unnatural pea soup fog. The ink on the back was a faded sepia, written in an elegant, looping cursive she hadn't seen since her grandmother's letters. But it wasn't the script that made the air in Celeste Vaughn's lungs turn to ice. It was the scent, a faint, almost gone whisper of lilac and vanilla, whispering lilac. A cheap drugstore perfume she doused herself in as a teenager in Ohio, dreaming of a life anywhere but there. A perfume that had been discontinued in 1989, the same year she landed her first speaking role. For 30 years, the Solstice Club had been Hollywood's most persistent ghost story. A fable told by has-beens and hopefuls alike. It was the ultimate after-party, the one you couldn't buy your way into. Whispers in green rooms spoke of it as a reward, a secret society for those who had navigated the treacherous waters of fame past the age of 45 without being relegated to playing cantankerous grandmothers or pitiable cougars. The price of admission was simply enduring. Tonight, the ghost had materialized. The address on the postcard led her to a part of San Francisco that tourists, and even most locals, forgot existed. A street of forgotten grandeur, where a decommissioned opera house stood like a beached whale, its sandstone facade stained dark with a century of rain and neglect. There was no red carpet, no velvet rope, no bouncer with a clipboard. There was only a single, heavy oak door, slightly ajar, leaking a sliver of buttery yellow light. Celeste Vaughn, 52, star of screen and stage, two-time Oscar nominee, and survivor of 3 public divorces, took a breath that tasted of salt and diesel fumes. She smoothed down the front of her tailored silk pantsuit, a deep emerald green that complemented the silver streaks in her hair she'd recently decided to embrace rather than dye. She arrived alone. She always arrived alone these days. As she pushed the door open, the sound from the street vanished. Not faded, but cut as if a switch had been flipped. The air inside was cool and still, thick with the smell of dust, old velvet, and something else ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. She stepped onto a floor of black and white marble tiles that stretched into a cavernous, gilded ballroom. Red velvet curtains, the color of dried blood, hung in tatters from towering arched windows. Marbled columns, veined with gray and gold, held up a ceiling painted with faded cherubs and apocalyptic-looking clouds. And mirrors, God, the mirrors. They lined every wall, framed in ornate, tarnished gold. Tall, imposing mirrors. Small, intimate mirrors, convex mirrors that warped the room into a dizzying fishbowl. They reflected the columns, the curtains, the marble floor, her own emerald suit. But they did not reflect the colossal, crystal chandelier that hung like a spider from the center of the ceiling, its 1,000 teardrop pendants glittering with an internal, sourceless light. The omission was so glaring, so fundamentally wrong, that it made her feel nauseous. Other people were here. figures she recognized from a lifetime of flipping through magazines and watching late-night television. There was Sleepless, the legendary jazz singer from the 60s, looking impossibly, unnervingly the same as he did on his album covers, not a day over 30. Across the room, a former Secretary of State stood rigid as a statue, his famous jowls slack, his eyes fixed on nothing. She saw actors she'd worked with, rivals she'd lost roles to, musicians whose songs were the soundtrack to her youth. All of them frozen, scattered throughout the room like chess pieces in a game that had been interrupted. They were a gallery of preserved beauty and exquisite decay. At the center of the ballroom, directly beneath the unreflected chandelier, stood a statue. It was carved from a pale, veined stone that seemed to absorb the light. A life-sized woman draped in classical robes, her arms outstretched in a gesture that was either a welcome or a plea. But where her face should have been, there was only a smooth, concave void, polished to a dull sheen. And in the center of her chest, where her heart would be, was a gaping hole. Inside the hole, something dark and organic pulsed with a slow, wet, rhythmic beat that Celeste could feel in the soles of her expensive shoes. A soft tap, tap, tap echoed through the hall. Every head turned. A figure was approaching a single golden microphone that stood beside the statue. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, but like the statue, he had no face. Just a smooth, unbroken plane of pale skin where eyes, nose, and a mouth should have been. It was the most terrifying thing Celeste had ever seen. The silence in the room became absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all thought. The faceless host leaned towards the microphone. When he spoke, the voice was not his own. It was a composite, 1,000 voices, male, female, young, old, all speaking in perfect, chilling unison. "Welcome, luminaries," the voice whispered, yet it filled every corner of the room. "You have endured, you have remained, you are the constants in a world of variables, but constancy requires maintenance." The host paused, letting the words hang in the dead air. Celeste's own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counterrhythm to the pulsing in the statue's chest. "Tonight," the voice continued, the sound seeming to curdle in the air, "one of you will be remembered. The others will be re-edited. ACT2, the offer." A silent procession of waiters, all dressed in the same featureless black as the host, began to move through the crowd. They carried silver trays laden with glasses of deep red wine. Celeste took one, her hand trembling slightly. The glass was wrong. It was heavier than glass, cool and dense like polished obsidian, and it made no sound when her ring tapped against it. She took a sip. The wine was rich and complex, tasting of black cherry, old leather, pomegranate, and a faint metallic tang of dread. It warmed her from the inside out, a treacherous comfort. The static tableau of guests broke. Murmurs rippled through the room. People began to drift, to converse, their movements slow and deliberate, like swimmers underwater. Celeste found herself standing near Sleepless, the jazz singer who hadn't aged since the Kennedy administration. He was still glowing, his skin smooth, his eyes clear and bright. He caught her staring. "It's a sight, isn't it?" he said, his voice as smooth and smoky as his famous recordings. "How?" the word escaped Celeste's lips as a raw whisper. "How do you look like that?" A slow, sad smile touched his lips. It didn't quite reach his eyes. "I paid the second price," he said, taking a slow sip of his wine. "The second price?" Celeste asked, bewildered. "What was the first?" Sleepless looked away towards the pulsing statue. "My reflection. Gave it up in '78. Haven't seen myself in a mirror since. It's freeing in a way." "You stop counting the lines," he chuckled, a hollow, tuneless sound. "But then they come for the echoes." Before she could ask what he meant, her attention was snagged by a familiar face. Marcus Thorne. They had started out together on a daytime soap, As the Tide Turns, back in '91. He looked good, she thought, a little too good. His hair was still implausibly thick, his jawline sharp. But he wasn't speaking to the woman beside him. He was mouthing words, his expression shifting from anguish to joy to fury in a silent, seamless loop. His eyes were vacant. He was performing a scene only he could see, trapped in a phantom script. Celeste felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She turned and saw Alina Vance, a once revered news anchor who'd been unceremoniously fired for a single on-air gaffe. Alina was staring intently at a cocktail napkin, her brow furrowed in concentration. She wasn't holding a pen. She was tracing words onto the napkin with the tip of her index finger, and as she did, the letters appeared, glowing with a soft, phosphorescent light before fading away. She was scribbling furiously, a stream of headlines from a future that would never happen, a career that no longer existed. Everyone here was broken in some beautiful, terrifying way. They weren't guests, they were exhibits. Then one of the faceless waiters approached her. He wasn't carrying a tray of wine. He held a single, thick, cream-colored envelope on a small silver platter. He stopped directly in front of her, extending the platter. Her name was written on the front in the same cursive from the postcard. Celeste Vaughn, your edit is pending. Do you accept the recasting? Panic, cold and absolute seized her. This wasn't a party, it was a transaction. A hostile takeover of the soul. Her fight-or-flight instinct screamed and she chose flight. She murmured an apology to no one in particular and turned, walking briskly. Not running, never run, it shows weakness towards the main doors. But the ballroom had changed. The mirrors, which had before reflected the room, now showed other things. The one nearest the door showed a long, sterile corridor, flickering with fluorescent lights like a hospital wing. Another showed a sun-drenched beach, waves crashing silently. They weren't reflections anymore. They were doorways. As she watched, a man she recognized, a character actor famous for playing villains, stared into a mirror showing a dusty, sunlit library. He took a hesitant step, then another, and walked directly into his reflection, vanishing from the ballroom without a sound. The mirror shimmered for a moment, then went dark. People were stepping into the mirrors, disappearing one by one into idealized, silent worlds. A choice, an exit, an edit. One man, a rock guitarist from the 80s whose fame had been devoured by his addictions, refused. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound of defiance, and threw his heavy wine glass at the nearest mirror. The glass didn't shatter the mirror. It passed through it and clattered onto the floor of the idyllic meadow scene within. The guitarist backed away, eyes wide with terror, bumping into the central statue. His mistake. The shadow cast by the unreflected chandelier seemed to deepen, to coalesce. It peeled itself off the marble floor like a living thing and wrapped around the guitarist's ankles. He was yanked off his feet, his body dragged into the pure, featureless darkness. His scream didn't just stop. It played in reverse, a horrifying inhalation of sound until he was gone. The shadow retreated, once again becoming just a patch of darkness on the floor. Celeste's blood ran cold. She was trapped. She spun around, looking for any way out, and came face to face with herself. A woman stood before her, wearing an identical emerald green pantsuit. The same silver-streaked hair, styled in the same way. The same fine lines around her eyes. The same small, faded scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall. It was a perfect copy. The woman smiled Celeste's smile, but it was empty, a mimicry of warmth. "It's not so bad," the double said, her voice a flawless imitation of Celeste's own. "A few scenes get trimmed, a few memories get reshot. You'll be lighter, happier." What are you?" Celeste stammered. The double's smile widened slightly. "I'm the understudy, ready to go on. All you have to do is accept the recasting. Say yes, and I'll forget everything that hurts. I'll carry the spotlight and you can rest." She gestured towards one of the mirrors, which now showed a cozy, firelit room with a book resting on an armchair. "Say yes, and I'll forget everything." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Say no, and you'll remember too much. ACT 3, The Missing Scene. Terror gave her legs a life of their own. Celeste shoved past her unnerving twin and fled, not towards the treacherous mirrors, but towards the side of the ballroom, plunging through a heavy velvet curtain into the wings of the old opera house. The air immediately changed, growing thick with the scent of rope dust, dried paint, and mouse droppings. The gilded illusion of the party fell away, replaced by the raw, functional skeleton of the theater. She stumbled through a labyrinth of dusty flats painted with forest scenes, past racks of decaying costumes that crumbled to the touch, their sequins like fish scales on the grimy floor. The silence back here was different, a waiting, breathing silence. She could hear the faint, insistent pulse from the statue, a monstrous heart beating at the center of the maze. Her flight led her downwards, down a narrow, winding staircase of creaking iron. The air grew cooler, damper. She emerged into the orchestra pit. The velvet-cushioned chairs were empty, covered in a century of dust, but the music stands were not. Sheets of music sat open on each one, the notes black and stark against the yellowed paper. And the violins, cellos, and basses, resting on their sides, played themselves. Bows hovered in the air, sawing back and forth across strings, producing a thin, discordant melody that scraped at the nerves. It was a symphony of ghosts. It was there, tucked away in a dusty alcove beneath the lip of the stage, that she found them. Stacks of old, metal film reels, the kind she hadn't seen in decades. They were stored on metal shelves, each canister labeled with a neat, typed sticker. She ran her fingers along the spines, her breath catching in her throat. The labels were names, names she knew. James Dean Final Take, 1955. Marilyn Monroe Final Take, 1962. River Phoenix Final Take, 1993. Names of icons who died tragically, their legends cemented by their youth. But the collection was vast. It included not just the famous dead, but the famous who had simply faded. A sitcom star from the 70s, a politician disgraced in the 90s, an author who wrote one perfect novel and then never published again. Each had a final take dated the year their public story ended. Her fingers froze on a canister near the bottom. The metal was cold, humming with a faint energy. The label felt like a death sentence. Celeste Vaughn Final Take, 1998. The year her career had been on the brink of collapse. She'd been dropped by her agent after a string of box office flops. The tabloids called her difficult, uninsurable. She'd been desperate, drinking too much, a hair's breadth from returning to Ohio in defeat, and then everything changed. She booked a small, independent film that no one expected anything from, and her performance, it was different, controlled, precise. It revitalized her career, leading to her first Oscar nomination. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the latch, Celeste pried open the canister. The film reel inside looked pristine. Beside the shelf sat an old, clunky Steenbeck editing machine, covered in dust but inexplicably plugged into a glowing socket in the wall. With a sense of dreamlike dread, she threaded the film. She flicked a switch. The machine whirred to life. A grainy, flickering image appeared on the small screen. It was her, a younger her from 1998. Her hair was longer, darker. Her face was fuller, but her eyes were haunted with a desperation she remembered all too well. She was standing on the edge of a wooden pier at night, the lights of a city shimmering across the water. She was crying. She was saying something, but the film was silent. Then she walked off the pier. The film showed her body sinking into the black water, her face pointed towards the uncaring sky, bubbles streaming from her lips, drowning. The final shot was of the empty, black water, held for an uncomfortable length of time before the film flapped to its end. Except it never happened. She had never been to that pier. She had never tried to kill herself. But the date stamp in the corner of the film, a barely visible digital smudge, matched the exact week her life had turned around. The week she'd landed the role in Winter's Bone. The memory fracture wasn't a coincidence. It was an implantation. That year she'd started forgetting things. Small things at first, appointments, names, then bigger things. She'd show up to set and deliver lines perfectly, lines she had no memory of ever learning. Directors who once called her erratic now praised her as unshakably consistent, a consummate professional. She never missed a mark, she never flubbed a take. It wasn't her talent, it was programming. She hadn't been saved. She had been replaced. The real Celeste Vaughn, the messy, flawed, desperate woman from Ohio, had drowned in 1998. She was the edit. She was the double. A wave of vertigo washed over her, so profound she had to grip the cold metal of the Steenbeck to keep from falling. Who was she? What was she? A collection of curated memories and programmed responses, wrapped in the flesh of a dead woman. She looked up, her gaze falling on a shard of a broken mirror leaning against the far wall of the pit. In its fractured surface, she saw her own reflection. Haggard, terrified, and then something impossible happened. Her reflection blinked, but she hadn't. She stared frozen as the face in the mirror, her face, smiled a slow, conspiratorial smile. Its lips moved, but the voice echoed not from the glass, but inside her own head, a clear, sharp thought that was not her own. "You want out," the reflection asked. "You want to be more than just the epilogue to someone else's story. Then you have to break the narrative, film your own ending." Celeste slowly turned. Standing at the top of the iron staircase, silhouetted against the light from the ballroom, was the faceless host. He had followed her. In his perfectly gloved hands, he held an antique brass sandwood silent film camera, its lens like a single dead eye. ACT4, the audition. The host glided down the stairs, his movements utterly silent, and placed the ancient camera on a tripod in the center of the orchestra pit. The self-playing instruments fell quiet. The only sounds were the hum of the Steenbeck and the frantic pounding of Celeste's own, possibly borrowed heart. He produced a slim stack of papers, bound with a simple brass clip, and handed them to her. The title on the cover page was embossed in gold leaf, "The Final Memory." "Your audition," the composite voice of the host stated, devoid of inflection. "Perform the final scene. Convince us that you still possess agency. That the author is not yet dead." Celeste's hands trembled as she flipped the cover page. The first page was a single line of dialogue, "I remember everything." As she read it, the ink seemed to writhe on the page like black worms before the paper itself curled at the edges, turned to ash, and dissolved into nothingness in her hand. She flipped to the next page. It contained a stage direction. She looks at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. That page, too, blackened and disintegrated. The script was devouring itself as she read it. It was a memory designed to be performed once and then cease to exist. A cold, hard fury began to replace her terror. A lifetime of being told what to say, where to stand, how to feel by agents, directors, and critics had coalesced into this one, final, monstrous command. They wanted a performance. They wanted her to act out her own erasure. She let the remaining pages of the script fall to the dusty floor. "No," she said, her voice low but clear, resonating with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I won't act anymore, not for you." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The faceless host didn't move. He simply stood, a void in a tuxedo, watching her. Then the lights in the orchestra pit dimmed, and a beam of light shot from the lens of the antique camera, projecting a new film onto the grimy brick wall behind her. It wasn't the drowning scene. It was her, throughout the years. A montage of her failures, a botched line from her first sitcom, met with the canned laughter of a studio audience. A scene from a historical drama where she tripped over her own gown, the crew trying to stifle their snickers. The raw, ugly footage of a paparazzi video, catching her screaming at her third husband in a parking garage, her face blotchy with real tears. Every mistake, every moment of weakness, every real cry behind the fake smiles. It was a reel of her humanity presented as a blooper. From the ballroom above, a new sound started, a slow, rhythmic clapping, but the sound was wrong. It was the sterile, flat sound of hands striking, but without the satisfying smack of flesh on flesh. It was applause without impact, a hollow loop of approval for her humiliation. Cut. The voice was sharp, authoritative, and it was her own. The film snapped in half, the projected image melting into a white flare before dying. The clapping stopped. Celeste looked up towards the stage. Standing in the single spotlight where the lead actor would take their bow was the double, the woman in the identical emerald suit. She held one hand up, palm out. "You're boring us," the double said, her voice filled with a theatrical disappointment. "All this angst, all this refusal, it's such a cliché. The tortured artist. You gave up your story the moment you decided it wasn't worth fighting for anymore." "I didn't." Before Celeste could form a reply, a shimmer of movement caught her eye. From the shard of broken mirror leaning against the wall, a third figure was emerging. It unfolded itself from the glass like a photograph developing in reverse. Another perfect copy of her, the one whose reflection had spoken to her. The reflection stepped out onto the floor of the pit, its movements fluid and uncanny. It stood beside the double on the stage. Now there were three of them, the actress. The understudy, the ghost in the machine. The faceless host turned his blank head, surveying the three identical women, the one in the pit, trembling with fury and existential dread. The two on the stage, poised and confident. His composite voice echoed through the now silent theater, posing the ultimate question. "Which one," he asked, "is the original?" "ACT5, the edit." The question hung in the air, a poisoned dart aimed at the very concept of her identity. Which one was the original? The answer was none of them. The original was at the bottom of a bay, a forgotten frame on a reel of film. These were just copies, echoes, edits. But in that moment, Celeste realized the question wasn't the test. The test was the answer. They wanted her to choose to define herself within their framework, to pick a role. The defiant one, the perfect one, the ethereal one she would not play. With a scream that was pure, unadulterated rage, a sound torn from the deepest part of her, she lunged. Not for her copies, not for the host. She lunged for the golden microphone that still stood by the central statue in the ballroom above. She scrambled out of the pit, her nails digging into the dusty stage, and seized the microphone stand. The metal was cold and alive. She yanked it from its base, the feedback shriek of a disconnected cable screaming through the opera house. She held it like a weapon and screamed into it, not her stage name, the name on the film canister, the name that had been bought and sold and edited for decades. She screamed the name she was born with, the name on a tattered birth certificate in a county office in rural Ohio. The name of the girl who loved whispering lilac perfume. "My name is CLARA-MAEJNKINS." The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. It was as if she had spoken the secret, structural name of God, and the universe couldn't bear it. The opera house began to collapse in on itself, but in reverse. The mirrors didn't shatter outwards. They imploded, glass fragments flying into the frames and reassembling into perfect, unbroken surfaces that now reflected only darkness. The giant chandelier, instead of falling, shot upwards into the ceiling, pulling plaster and dust with it until it vanished. The pulsing in the central statue stopped, and the stone figure crumbled, not into dust, but into a pile of yellowed, brittle paper, like the pages of an ancient script. The guests, Silas, Marcus, Eleanor, all of them cried out. Their bodies flickered, their outlines blurring. They turned translucent, then solidified into strips of celluloid film, curling and twisting in midair as if touched by an invisible flame, burning away into nothing with a faint chemical smell. Through it all, the faceless host remained perfectly still, watching her. As the world dissolved around them, he leaned close, his featureless face inches from hers. His composite voice was gone, replaced by a single, dry, sibilant whisper that sounded like rustling paper. "You passed the audition," he whispered. Celeste squeezed her eyes shut. The sound of chaos, the smell of burning film, the feeling of the world unmaking itself, it all vanished. She opened her eyes. The blinding, percussive blast of camera flashes stunned her. The roar of a crowd of reporters shouting her name, Celeste, Celeste, over here, filled her ears. She was standing on a plush red carpet. The night air was cool. Searchlights sliced through the sky. She was outside at the gala, the one she thought she had been trying to get into. The decommissioned opera house was gone. In its place stood a modern, glass and steel concert hall, alive with light and energy. No one else seemed to notice that anything was amiss. She saw other actors, smiling, posing. No memory of the Solstice Club flickered in their eyes, except she looked closer. She saw a few of them. A young actor whose star was rising impossibly fast. A veteran actress who looked a decade younger than she had 6 months ago. They looked just a little too perfect. Their smiles were held a fraction of a second too long. They laughed at nothing. And as one of them walked past a mirrored column, Celeste saw her flinch, just for a moment, as if seeing something in her reflection that wasn't supposed to be there. They were the ones who had said yes. The ones who had stepped into the mirror. A wave of dizziness made her stumble. Was it real? Was any of it real? She felt a desperate need to get away. She pushed through the throng of photographers, ignoring their calls, and headed for the street. As she reached the curb, a small hand tugged at her sleeve. She looked down. A little girl no older than 7, with wide, serious eyes, was standing there. The child held out a piece of paper to her. It was a folded cocktail napkin. Celeste took it numbly. She unfolded it. Scrawled on the napkin, in letters that glowed with the same faint, phosphorescent light she had seen Alina Vance use, was a single, terrifying line. "You're still being watched."